volume work, but this is the first volume, and it deals with how debt originated in the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia, and how every ruler of Sumer and Babylonia, when they take the throne, their first act would be to proclaim a clean slate. They'd cancel the debts, they'd liberate people who were sunk into bondage for debt, and they'd redistribute land that was foreclosed on by creditors. In other words, what the Babylonian rulers would do, Hammurabi and his group, Sumerians in the 3rd millennium, Hammurabi and the Babylonians in the 2nd millennium, were exactly what the Jews took over, Judaism took over in the 1st millennium, when the exiled Jews returned from Babylonia back into Judea, and applied this 3-point debt cancellation as the Jubilee year, and they wrote it into the very core of Leviticus, into the core of Mosaic law, and that became they rewrote the whole history of the Old Testament is a struggle between debtor and creditor interests. The kings by the 1st millennium no longer were canceling the debts, not only in the Jewish lands, but in the Mediterranean. They went over to the side of the oligarchs where they survived, the creditors. And so it was the religious leaders that took debt cancellation out of the hands of the kings and put that at the center of the basic religion. And this was the case by the time of Jesus. And we know now from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the whole cult around Melchizedek, that debt cancellation was a popular pressure opposed by the leading Jewish rabbis, such as Hillel, who introduced the prose bull saying, we waive all the rights under the Jubilee year to have our debts canceled. And this is what Jesus spoke about in the very first sermon that he gave. Luke describes how Jesus went to the temple, unrolled the scroll of Isaiah, and where Isaiah was calling for a debt cancellation, the year of the Lord, the Jubilee year, and Jesus said, I've come to proclaim the Jubilee year and to fulfill this prophecy. And Luke says that the people around him in his hometown where he gave the sermon got angry at him, tried to drive him out, and started a whole political fight between the creditor interests, who by that time had gained control of the Jewish church, and Jesus, who said, wait a minute, this is, I want to restore the original Judaism with the debt cancellation and the Mosaic law. And we all know how it ended. He was put to death not because he was talking about rescuing people from sins, but rescuing people from debt. And the word from sin and debt are the same because in archaic language, the word for debt was originally the main thing that debts were taken up for, to pay for having committed a sin, namely personal injury. What we know in Indo-European culture is vergelt, for killing somebody, for injuring them, for breaking an arm or whatever. This idea of sin is a debt Jesus generalized into the problem of his day, which were debts in general. So what I ended up doing is writing not only a history of debt cancellations and how they came to be and what the general philosophy was, all the way from Sumer and Babylonia through Judea and Israel, but also the history of how debt cancellation was woven into religion and became the key of religious fighting all the way down through the Byzantine epoch.
Right. Now, you talk about how people get into debt. Usually, you know, catastrophic things happen, illnesses happen, people get into debt, and then you have these debt jubilees, the slate is wiped clean, and the economies are restarted. I know when I was living in France, the new president, I believe, or the new mayor of Paris, whenever they got elected, they would forgive all parking tickets. You know, this was kind of a continuation of this theme. But the big question, though, Dr. Michael Hudson, is that we seem to have transitioned to an era where we no longer believe in debt jubilees, but we have what I guess you could call it a credit jubilee. In other words, in the 2008 crisis, that was a debt-driven crisis. The policy to come back and address that was not to forgive the debts, but to bail out the creditors. Is this an historic change? Have we seen this historically? Have we seen it before? And is it a dangerous precedent? Because the debt jubilee seemed to work for thousands of years. This is something kind of new, it seems. What are your thoughts?
Well, already in antiquity, you had the creditors, the oligarchs, the wealthy classes, saying that what is sacred is not canceling the debts, but enforcing their payments. And already by the 4th century in Athens, jurors and mayors throughout Greece were obliged to take an oath not to enact any policy that would cancel the debts or redistribute the land. And so already way back then, they put, the question was, what's going to be sacred? The creditor interests that lead to bankrupting society and pushing it into serfdom, or the debtor interests of most of the population at large, that in order to keep them from falling into bondage. So that if you look at modern mainstream histories of Greece and Rome, they say Western civilization is founded and differs from all other earlier civilizations with the sanctity of property. What they mean of the sanctity of property is really the sanctity of debt and the right of creditors to foreclose on the property of the population at large, to foreclose on the state, and to really take over the entire economy. So you could say that Western civilization is founded on the dynamic that led to serfdom in antiquity, and it's the same dynamic that you just described that we're going at today, reducing the population essentially to debt peonage. And that's the relevance of the study of antiquity, that what led to feudalism then is the tendency of debt to grow more rapidly than the ability to pay, that people fell into debt, not only because they were sick and had to borrow. 75% of the debts in Babylonia were not borrowed at all. They were tax arrears, your parking tickets from France. If most of the debts are unpaid taxes because of the crop failure that prevents the rural population from paying taxes, or because of other problems, then it's really the money to the state that was the main cause of debt. And today, of course, the creditors have taken over the state, and the state is the Democratic Party's donor class, Wall Street, and that you have an inversion of the old original Bronze Age recovery program, clean slates, to say debt is inexorable. We're not going to cancel the debts. We are only going to bail out the creditors and enable them to essentially reduce the rest of the population to bondage, where all of the income, all the economic surplus is paid for debt service, not for tangible investment, not for rising living standards. And that basically, the fight that we're having today has been fought again and again, all the way from Babylonia to the Near East, to the biblical lands, to Greece and Rome, and to the Byzantine Empire.
You know, I don't see it as often as I used to, but I used to see this phrase a lot. What would Jesus do? You know, it was maybe a bumper sticker or something. What would Jesus do? So let's go back to 2008 for a second. The global financial crisis. New president, Barack Obama. He's got a decision to make: bail out the debtors or bail out the creditors. So by the standard that you're talking about, the historical standard, the religious standard, the Christian standard, the Jesus standard, Jesus would have done the exact opposite to what Barack Obama did, Michael.
Well, what Obama did, really, he said, who am I going to do? Bail out my campaign contributors on Wall Street, or bail out the people who voted for me? And he said, look, I represent my campaign contributors. And he invited them to the White House. He invited the leading Wall Street people and said, look, I'm the only guy standing between you and the pitchforks. You know, I'm going to, don't worry, I'm on your side. And we know that he repeated that 2 days ago at McCain's funeral. He said, McCain and I had no difference in policy at all. Well, here is McCain, one of the Keating Five, who backed the savings and loan ripoff by Charles Keating and pressured Alan Greenspan not to prosecute, not to regulate the savings and loans. You have very clearly Obama on the side of the creditors and the crooks. The difference between antiquity is today is the creditors normally used political assassination of almost every leading debtor advocate, all the way from the Gracchi brothers in Rome to Julius Caesar, who took a populist pro-debtor policy. Well, today, the creditor class only does that in Chile and Argentina and third world countries. It hasn't done that in the United States yet, because there really isn't any discussion either in the religious community or on the left realizing that the dynamic that's making people poor is primarily financial. It's debt. It's the financial system's dysfunctional relationship, not the old-fashioned idea that, the industrialists are exploiting the workers. Well, of course, corporations exploit the workers, but now they moved abroad to exploit foreign workers. Again, it's largely a financial-driven austerity program that we're at. So yes, Jesus would have bailed out, would have canceled the debts and written off the bad debts, like the German economic miracle did, and said, this is the economic miracle. We're going to have a clean slate. Next time, the creditors should take responsibility and not make bad loans. And the function of the banking system should be to serve the economy, not the economy should serve the banking system and the takeover of the 1% that controls most of the banks.
All right, Dr. Michael Hudson, fantastic. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
It's always good to be here, Max.
All righty. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Michael Hudson. His new book,